So welcome everyone to our bi-weekly Wednesday webinar hosted by the Bicycle Coalition of Maine. And today we have a really interesting topic about crash reports. These are the type of reports that we would see in police reports, also in publications when a journalist creates the report based on a crash and what data is available. We find that many times the data that is presented is inaccurate. And of course that leads to problems down the road with misperceptions and improper practices sort of being promoted. So we're going to dive right into that today. We have myself, my name is Eric De Silva. I work for the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, and two of my colleagues, Matt Solem and Eliza Kress, are also joining. We also have two special guests. One of them is Lauri Boxer-Macomber. She's an attorney who works for Kelly Remmel and Zimmerman. She also focuses on bicycle and pedestrian advocacy, and she is a board member for the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, and she does quite a bit of work for bike law. So thank you, Lauri, for being present. And along with Lauri, we have Gersh Kunstman, and he is a very famous journalist. He's worked for many, he laughs, but he's got quite an esteemed career, and he does quite a bit of work with Streetsblog, which is sort of a online blog, bicycle and pedestrian advocacy, and trying to forward a better world through this type of action. So let's get right into it. Our first speaker is going to be Eliza Kress, and she's going to go into some of the statistics and data that we see come out of this. And Eliza, would you like to take it away?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eliza. I am the Outreach and Design Manager for the Bicycle Coalition of Maine. And this morning, I will be sharing the results of a study titled Holistic Reporting of Bicycle Pedestrian Crashes, a Maine study conducted by Nick Suarez, a soon-to-be 2021 graduate of Bowdoin University. Nick's work took a close look at crash reporting involving pedestrians, cyclists, and motor vehicles in Maine, specifically from 2018 to 2019. The purpose of his study was to shed light on the importance of holistic crash reporting when it comes to public perception of these incidences and how perception could improve road safety for all users. In the words of Robert Entman, reports of accidents involving cyclists and pedestrians are common in local news across the country. Whether you realize it or not, news reports affect your judgment of a crash, even without witnessing it for yourself. Beyond the individual incident, however, a reporter's presentation or framing of an issue through the selection or omittance of facts prescribes certain causes, judgments, and solutions to the reader. Before we take a deeper dive into Nick's study, I would like to start with two polls. Eric, if you could please launch the first poll, that would be great. So, do you think the statement describing a crash includes bias? The statement is, the victim, a man in his late 60s who was wearing dark clothing, was walking along Mud Creek Road when he was hit by a truck around 7:20 p.m. All right, so 78% of you believe that this statement has bias. So that's a pretty astute audience that we have today. And before kind of jumping into talking about this a little bit further, Eric, I will ask you to launch the second poll. Does the following statement leave you with the same impression as the previous description of a crash? The driver of a pickup truck veered out of the travel lane on Mud Creek Road around 7:20 p.m., striking and killing a man in his late 60s. So, everyone who voted on this determined that, in fact, this left them with a different perception of the crash. So the important takeaway from this exercise is that both statements factually describe the incident. However, they present a very different perspective on who or what is responsible for that crash. So I will go ahead, and Eric, am I good to share my screen at this point?
Yes, please go ahead.
Awesome. So I'm going to share this one. Okey-dokey. Great. Okay. So for our purposes, as an advocacy organization, Nick's study is important because it helps to highlight to the extent crashes are depicted as thematic or interconnected, or conversely as episodic or isolated incidents, and why these depictions are critical in the aftermath of a crash, the importance of holistic reporting, and the impact of these reports on public perception of traffic violence. Nick's study focuses on 76 crash reports that don't necessarily represent 76 unique crashes. His research revealed that 60% of all crash reports in Maine were written by 3 news outlets, and those stories were typically shared or printed with few or no edits by other sources. Keisha Pollock's diagram shown here illustrates the different levels of contributing factors to crashes that involve vulnerable users, a term used to describe bicyclists, people on bikes or pedestrians, and motor vehicles. Historically speaking, crash reports typically capture only interpersonal factors and fail to consider more systemic variables that can contribute to a crash. Nick found this trend to be present in virtually all crash reporting of this kind in Maine. Of the 76 articles that Nick reviewed, only 3 referenced community or societal levels in crash reporting. These specific articles mentioned infrastructure projects, pedestrian safety meetings, and local legislation regarding road safety. Similarly, the 76 reports only referred to 4 previous of the 76 reports, only 4 referenced previous crashes. While rare, these reports are important because they call attention to various other factors that contribute to crashes. Framing crashes in this way shifts the blame away from the victim and allows the reader to understand crashes in a more holistic manner. As Kelsey Ralph states, with episodic reporting, readers are more likely to hold individuals accountable for accidents rather than public officials or transportation engineers. By framing crashes in a context of historical trends or ongoing safety initiatives, citizens become better informed, less willing to place blame on individuals, and more likely to recognize crashes as a problem to be solved rather than an unpreventable occurrence. Ultimately, this study sought to examine the landscape of bicycle and pedestrian accidents across the state of Maine and determine whether reports reference municipalities' efforts to promote multimodal transportation. For the purposes of today's presentation, the 3 takeaways from Nick's study are as follow. 1, biased and improper framing of crashes leads the public to believe that victims of traffic violence are entirely responsible for crashes and that these crashes are episodic events isolated from other crashes or a larger problem. 2, the framing of crashes as thematic or interconnected is rare. However, efforts to promote cycling and walking seem to correlate with more nuanced crash reporting. Crash reports that reference past incidences, safety initiatives appear to be indicative of communities that promote multimodal transportation or are undergoing road safety policy reform. And 3, a more holistic approach to crash reporting would help to illustrate traffic violence as a public safety issue. Reporting that includes community level and societal factors that contribute to a crash, such as speed limit, roadway design, and even automobile design, would allow residents and bike ped advocates to understand why crashes happen and better equip them to initiate safety measures in their communities. Understandably, media outlets want to report on crashes as quickly as they occur with any available information. However, writing a follow-up story or updating an existing story is one effective strategy for contextualizing an individual crash. Similarly, when reporters are investigating a story, it's critical that they ask the right questions in order to minimize the possibility of biased reporting. This is something that I'll allow Gersh to expand on in the following segment of this presentation. Unfortunately, crash reporting is frequently done using police reports. Regrettably, police reports are often riddled with biased information and frequently only take into account the driver's perspective of an incident. In the case of a crash involving a vulnerable user and a motorist, the individual hit by the driver of a motor vehicle typically sustains serious injuries or is killed. Consequently, their side of the story often goes untold or is not investigated until after the initial police report has been written, if at all. The Bicycle Coalition of Maine has developed police training for crashes that involve pedestrians and people on bikes, but the program has yet to be adopted or implemented into ongoing police training or into a police academy. I'll allow Lauri, who has been involved in this work, to touch on this if anyone has any questions later in the presentation. While Nick's study offers a framework for evaluating bicycle and pedestrian accident coverage in the context of local pedestrian safety efforts, there's significant room to expand on its findings. Ultimately, a reduction in the number of crashes as a result of safety policies and improvements to infrastructure will have a more significant impact than changes in media coverage. However, with pedestrians and bicycle crashes on the rise nationally and in Maine, Nick's study took a closer look at the role that reporting can play on shifting public perception of the problem. To quote Elizabeth Shanahan, citizens are capable of informed and sound judgment when they have access to reliable facts and interpretations of an issue. In conclusion, I will pass the mic to our other speakers and allow them to elaborate on this topic outside of the research conducted by Nick Suarez.
So just a reminder to everyone to please feel free to use that chat window that's in the Zoom so that you can ask a question, or if you have a comment, chime in, please. Let's keep this as interactive as we can. Thank you, Eliza, for going through holistic crash reporting. Next up, we have Gersh. He's going to be talking about reports as written by law enforcement, and also some questions that every crash report should answer. So Gersh, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Eliza. That really set me up perfectly, because I have I got to share my screen about a couple of things. So I edit Streetsblog, which is a website devoted to the the movement for livable streets. And a big element of that is getting car drivers to stop killing us. And the ways in which that can be achieved, obviously, are through design and education, but also enforcement. And unfortunately, in almost every city in America, enforcement is done by the local police department or the sheriff's department, which has officers who are almost always in their cars, whether it's driving from their suburban homes to their city jobs, or just as part of their patrolling, they're in their cars all day long. And as a result, they have serious inherent bias. And I wanted to share my screen to show a couple of things. It's going to take me a minute to find the window that I wanted to share. Hold on one second.
And Gersh, we do have that poll if you want to run it at some point about asking about.
Start with the poll while I look for this. Start with the poll.
All right, so the poll just came up. How often does your local law enforcement agency police out of the patrol car? For example, walking a beat, bicycle patrol. So we would like to know how often you witness this or don't witness it.
This is a good poll.
We got almost 60%, 70. Let's try to get at least over 90. Would you like to read that out, or should I?
So basically, it asks the question, how often does your local law enforcement agency police out of the patrol car? Only one person said commonly. The biggest answer was rarely, that they see an officer out of a patrol car. And the second biggest answer was never. So rarely and never amounted to about 79% of this poll, and sometimes was about 17% of the poll, which is pretty common. In New York City, where I live, I would say it's rarely you'd see that. So let me just share one thing I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. So you should all be seeing a Streetsblog story. I just wanted to mention, Eliza talked about how very rarely do crash reports in local papers, and this is definitely true in New York, refer to the systemic problems of the roadway where the crash happened. That's something that we do at Streetsblog uniformly, no matter when a crash happens, where a crash happened. We always point out the problems of both the neighborhood and the road in question. This was a crash yesterday, believe it or not, that happened on a fairly major street in Brooklyn, New York. And if you actually look at it, so the 94th precinct, just so you know, probably contains about, I don't know, about 60,000 people. So it's a small town. In this particular small town, in the course of a year, there'll be about 2,000 crashes in a year. And if you're having 2,000 crashes in a small town, that's a pretty big problem. That's a lot of crashes. And in New York, every one of our small towns, so there's 77 police precincts in New York, have 5 to 10 crashes per day. In New York City, we have 220,000 reported crashes a year, which is a couple of hundred, 150, I think, a day. Nonetheless, when the local newspapers report on these individual crashes, they never, I won't even say almost never, they never report even just a simple paragraph like, by the way, the neighborhood where this happened is exceptionally dangerous. And we use those terms to describe the danger. I'm sharing another story, which is, oh, actually, let me first share this one. This is a story that no reporter in New York would ever write because they aren't trained to do this kind of thing. I happen upon a crash that I saw because I was the cyclist directly behind the cyclist that got hit by the car driver. And I stayed at the scene, not only to help him, obviously, but to watch what the police response would be. And as Eliza mentioned, the vast majority of people who are hit by car drivers are so severely injured or dead that they can't provide their part of their side of the story, or what they witnessed, if you will. This gentleman was not that severely injured, but the police officers didn't even bother to interview him when he was in the ambulance, and then he was taken away and there was no follow-up. And then if you scroll down in the story, the crash occurred because of this illegally parked car. I don't know if you can see that, it's a Honda with a MD plates. This illegally parked car prevented the driver from seeing the cyclist. See, this is the driver's view. And I bring it up only because any officer responding to that crash should have, A, found out why this car was illegally parked, probably ticketed that car, and included that in the narrative so that potentially the Department of Transportation in the city of New York could not make this merely a painted parking space, but a place where no one could park. You could raise the curb, you could put bollards, you could do something if indeed they don't want someone parking there. But that information is never passed on to the Department of Transportation in the city of New York. So information like that never makes it to the authorities. And here's the car still in position seconds after hitting the cyclist. Anyway, I mentioned that because it gets to the bias of police officers. They're in their cars all day long. And when they arrived on the scene of this particular crash, I watched them talk to the driver, and they were consoling her and reminding her how sad it is that she was put in the position of hitting someone rather than caring for the circumstances, and realizing, in fact, that she is guilty of failure to exercise due care, failure to yield, and maybe other charges. None of that ever came up in their investigation. And as a result, and I'll share this other screen with you, this is a very common Streetsblog story in New York City that, and Eliza mentioned this, the preliminary report of any crash, and I don't say this with any malice, is just often wrong. And the reason it's wrong is not necessarily because of police bias. It's usually wrong because there's limited information, and police, like Eliza said, feel responsible to get basic information out to the public as soon as possible for a number of reasons, some of which aren't important and certainly don't serve the public. The public is much better served by full and complete crash reports. But as Eliza said, a crash will happen and then local papers will write it up, and there's never any follow-up unless the victim is someone of renown, or the driver was someone of renown, or drunk, or guilty of some other crime. Often in New York City, crashes are written up as only if someone was a hit and run driver or if someone was driving drunk. Most of the time it's just a car hit a pedestrian rather than a hit and run driver or a drunk driver hit a pedestrian. Very little agency is presented in the local media here. But anyway, I brought up this particular report because the NYPD's initial report was that the cyclist was on the sidewalk and then entered the roadway where he collided with the garbage truck. And because we stayed on this story, months later, they had to reveal that, in fact, the cyclist was not on the sidewalk. The cyclist had the green light and was traveling northbound on a roadway, and the garbage truck that was traveling southbound on the roadway turned directly into him and killed him. And nobody else covered that. I mean, the fact that the police were wrong on the initial report and then exonerated the cyclist that they had basically victim blamed in the press, nobody followed up on that except for us because and the only reason we followed up on that is because we were in touch with the victim's family's lawyer. Very few families engage legal representation to fight this, because ostensibly you're fighting the NYPD, and it's not their problem that your family member has been hurt or killed. So often there's civil damages, in this case against the garbage truck company, which did then have to pay a fairly significant settlement because the crash report was amended. So, there's a happy ending there. As a result of, there's a downside in the work that we do as bicycling and livable streets advocates, is that because every report is based on, because everything's based on the initial police report and even the subsequent police report, some prevailing narratives, we never really get to the bottom of it. Now, for example, we know that distracted pedestrians, often get blamed for their own deaths or injuries. And so New York State, to prove that distracted pedestrians isn't a thing, went back to police reports to determine how many people who had been hit by car drivers were distracted. But police reports never say that, for many of the reasons I've just outlined. They don't do a full analysis. They don't know whether a pedestrian was distracted, just as they don't know if a driver was distracted, or they certainly don't tell us. So in the end, this was a very positive report put out by the state of New York about victims, but it's based on bad information. At the end, I think it said basically only 2% of pedestrian fatality reports blamed electronic distraction. Now, as a matter of fact, that number is almost certainly higher, but the reports don't say it because the cops don't ask it, because the cops aren't curious, the cops don't know, the cops don't care. So I find that interesting, just even though this report ultimately bolstered what advocates have been saying, it's not really accurate. It's not fully accurate, let's put it that way. And then finally, I wanted to show you just a couple of things about, I wonder if I present this, do you guys see the presentation?
Yes.
You see, okay, good. So I'm going to show you raw NYPD crash reports that come to all members of the media. Now, first of all, reports are often old. I don't know if you noticed this. Actually, I can't run the animation. That's weird. Oh, I could do this. So reports are often old. I received this email on October 2nd, 2019, but it was reporting about a crash that happened about a month and a half earlier, which makes it very hard for reporters to go back to the scene and try to figure out what happened. If someone is still in the hospital, for example, well, when the crash happened, they're not still in the hospital when we get the report. So that's one thing off the bat. And this report had a gem of a detail. If you look at what's bold, it said that the pedestrians were crossing at the intersection and were subsequently struck by the vehicle as so now the vehicle is a person, as he attempted to swerve to avoid making contact with them. So think about, if you're a police officer and you write that detail, you're basically saying that this vehicle, the vehicle, not driven by any human being, but the vehicle saw these pedestrians and rather than slow down, attempted to swerve and then hit them. It almost, on the face of it, doesn't even make sense. But this gets into the news reports of most reporters in New York City. Like, they don't even think that easily could have been written. The driver ran into 3 people. Like, it's just as simple as that. So like I said, information doesn't often hold up or have any hold up to any scrutiny. Now, it also lacks basics, like often who had the light, who disobeyed the basic traffic rules. It never, ever in the city of New York includes basic design of the roadway, which gets back to that crash earlier. So this, just give you a few examples of this, and I'm refreshing my memory here myself. This one said, the vehicle struck the female pedestrian who was crossing north to south on Union Turnpike. It doesn't say whether there was a crosswalk, doesn't say who had the light. It doesn't say a lot of important details. And as Eliza said, all of these reports, I want to say all, virtually all, are based on a brief interview of the driver. Now, remember, if the driver's still on the scene, the driver has an is incredibly encouraged to tell the police, this pedestrian came out of nowhere, or of course I wasn't speeding, I never speed. Well, first of all, the speed limit in the city of New York is 25 miles an hour. Everybody speeds. It's almost impossible to drive on certain roadways in the city of New York at 25 miles an hour because of the way the roadway is designed and because of the way the lights are timed. But the police officer never asked that question. Oh, well, did you have the light? Or were you speeding to make time because you saw the pedestrian counter on the side of the road that was ticking down and you didn't want to go through the yellow? All those questions are never asked because the driver is, well, usually traumatized too. So I brought up this one, for example. This was also based on incredibly bad information. Look at what it says. It says the cyclist was ostensibly facing southbound on a roadway when he made contact with a box truck that was traveling on the roadway. So if the box truck was traveling and the cyclist made contact, we're going to need a little bit more information. We actually never got information on this one. It turns out that the video later showed that the cyclist was literally just waiting for the light when the box truck the box truck driver ran into him. But of course, that's not in there. And because this gentleman was homeless, this story never was followed up except by us. And I said, there's no follow-up. And I think that leads to one more thing. Oh my God, this was one of the most tragic stories I ever covered. So this was a gentleman who was hit by a US Postal Service truck. I don't know if you advocates in Maine know this, but Postal Service trucks don't have license plates. And as a result, it's the New York City Police Department never writes tickets to postal truck drivers, whether they park illegally or drive erratically or fail to exercise due care. This gentleman was crossing the road. And as drivers often do, they look up the road to see where other cars are, but they don't then check the roadway again to see whether a pedestrian has now emerged in front of their vehicle. So this driver just started driving, drove over Charles McLean, killing him on the scene, and subsequent reports blame the victim. What was he doing in front of that truck? Well, it was a stop sign. He was in a crosswalk, and the driver never looked to see him. We spent actually 2 years trying to figure out whether the Postal Service would discipline the driver, and the agency will not provide any details about that, and there's never any follow-up. One more thing I'll do quickly. So this was an interesting report by the police department that said that the pedestrian was struck, the driver struck the pedestrian crossing the avenue outside of the crosswalk. See, it says outside the crosswalk. Well, it turns out there's no crosswalk at that intersection. And any report should have pointed that out so that a reporter, other than me, could have said to the DOT, hey, there's no crosswalk there and a person just died. When are you going to put a crosswalk there? Which no reporter asked. So the last thing I want to say is Eliza had pointed out that a lot of reporters don't ask the basic questions. This is just a list of questions we ask the NYPD every time they put out a collision investigation report, because none of this information is ever, and I can say that, ever in the report. Was the driver distracted by his phone? Was he or she playing loud music in the car? Was there a passenger in the car? What was the speed of the driver? Like literally the most basic question, which is easy to ascertain now because cars have black boxes and there's video, and New York City has blanketed by 2,000 camera systems. What was the exact impact point, and how far did the body travel? This is something that is basic information that you find out well after the fact if you can get a hold of a full collision investigation report. Because if the body traveled a certain amount of feet, an investigator would know how fast the car driver was driving. How many witnesses did you talk to for this narrative? They never tell us that, but it's almost always based on the sole witness, because most crashes happen late at night and there aren't many witnesses. And then we always ask, did you determine anything peculiar about that intersection? One thing we almost never can figure out is, at the moment of the crash, was there a double parked car? Was there an illegally parked car? Was there construction happening overnight at that location? We don't know, because if you go to a Google Map image of the intersection, that's obviously a photo taken months, if not years earlier. So those are important things. So we always ask people, check all information from police, even basic facts, because the police are often incapable of providing us with basic facts, which lead to the kind of reports that Eliza's, that student report, described. So I'm going to end it there, but in the question and answer, obviously I can share more about what we see on the streets of New York.
Thank you, Gersh. Really interesting stuff. I'm glad that you're looking out for people down in New York and sharing what you find.
I try. That's right.
So before we're going to take a little intermission from the content, I want to just share what's coming up with our next two webinars and some other events that we're doing. So if you're interested, in 2 weeks, we're going to be returning to the evening hour. We're going to be talking about upper extremity injuries, preventing and healing them. So a common one that bicyclists may have would be like carpal tunnel. So how does this injury occur? What can we do to prevent it? Shoulder injuries, etc. 2 weeks from that, 4 weeks from today, also in the evening, we're going to be talking about e-bikes. We actually have someone coming up from a shop, and he's going to be talking about buying a bike, using the bikes, maintaining them. If you're on an e-bike, what are best practices? If you're on some of the more powerful ones, you can hold near 30 miles an hour, and that could be breaking the speed limit, but what does it do to other people who are walking, biking? So what are some of the best practices there? Some interesting content coming right up. Another event that we're going to be doing soon, happy to see return to Maine, is the bike swap. And it's not going to look like the one in the picture here. It's not going to be indoors. It's going to be outdoors. We're going to do it in such a way that it meets all the guidelines set by the CDC. So really excited. That's coming up in June. It'll be in downtown Portland. I hope you can check it out, whether you want to sell a bike or buy a used bike. This is a great time to find a used bike because new ones are very hard to come by. If you're interested in finding out more about the Bicycle Coalition of Maine and the way that we educate and advocate for better biking and walking in our state, go to bikemaine.org. And from there, you can click on events and then calendar, and you can find out about the upcoming webinars, about bicycle safety rodeos, about the bike swap, and any other events that we or our partners post. So a lot of good information there. We're going to hand it back out to our next speaker. Lauri's going to be talking about misconceptions, dangerous societal norms, and what we can do to change the status quo. So Lauri, feel free to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Sure, I may do some screen sharing, but I may just stay with you all for a while. First off, thank you to the Bicycle Coalition of Maine for hosting this webinar. I think one of the first steps to addressing some of the problems that we have with crash reporting is naming the problem. And so by holding webinars like this, we are moving in that direction. So thank you to the staff and the executive director for making this happen, and all of you for coming out and listening. I also just want to take one quick moment to announce that today is a really important day in our world of people who work with bicyclists and pedestrians. It's the Ride of Silence, the International Ride of Silence Day. Tonight, all across the world at 7 p.m., there are going to be rides honoring people who have been the victims of traffic trauma while riding their bikes. And so that's something that I encourage you all to participate in. BCM has a bunch of events listed on its website in Maine and in New Hampshire, and we hope that those of you who are in attendance today can attend your local Ride of Silence. So with those public service announcements, I wanted to just elaborate a little bit so you know who you're hearing from. My practice right now, probably for the past decade, has been primarily spent representing bicyclists and pedestrians who have been involved in traffic trauma. I work on public policy matters surrounding bicycling and pedestrian advocacy, but most of my day-to-day work is with people who have been involved in these crashes. So I have literally, between the cases I've turned down and the cases that I've had thousands of these cases come across my desk and looked at crash reports and looked at evidence and seen what happens when crashes are not properly reported, and see what happens downstream. And so I wanted to share with you some of those things. So first big point is that words matter. And I know you've been hearing this from other speakers, but we are given the wonderful gift of vocabularies. We have an array of words that we can use to describe things. And it's just horrific when we hear the word accident being used over and over and over again, and we use it ourselves to describe crashes that are actually preventable. So I invite you all to take that word out of your vocabulary when talking about these events. And if you prefer a more neutral word, you can go with collision or event or incident. But in fact, the Maine Bureau of Highway Safety has said that these events should be called crashes. And so, we should be calling them crashes as well, because people are making operational choices and have the ability to control whether they use a cell phone while driving, whether they operate around a jogger at 5 miles an hour or 45 miles an hour. And so it's really important that we use the proper terminology and kind of follow in the steps of Justice Ginsburg, who said, words matter. In her opinion, she was very adamant about making sure that her words painted stories, and ours do too. We should be thinking about that the same way, because everything that we do from the time of the crash forward matters. So as we heard from Gersh, often at the scene of a crash, the victim is unable to tell their side of the story. And sometimes even when they are, as those of you who ride bikes and run know, a lot of the people that are hurt are used to being Superman or Superwoman. And so they'll often say, like, I'm okay, even though they just suffered a major head injury, or their pelvis is broken, or something more extreme than that. They'll often say, it's okay, I'm fine, and he didn't mean to do it, or whatever. And there'll be, some of us who are inclined to be more apologetic will make statements at the scene of the crash. Or in many situations, people are unconscious, which is really the bigger problem, or have a head injury and can't really convey their position, or have some other type of catastrophic injury. And so what happens is that there is this parade of horribles that follows. You end up with compounding and cumulative negative impacts on the victim, because when you think about it, it's like the telephone game. If when someone's injured, they can't tell their side of the story, and the driver says, oh, that bicyclist veered in front of me and was operating all crazy, and that's not really what happened, that driver's story then goes to the police. The police then say that to reporters that ask about the case. They also sometimes say it to rescue workers. And so, for example, if the driver says, no, he didn't hit his head, or the police officer decides that the bicyclist didn't hit his or her head, they'll say that to the rescue workers. It gets put in a hospital record when the rescue worker does the handoff at the hospital. The hospital then sends that report to the primary care provider, because that's what hospitals do. They send your hospital ER reports to your primary care provider, goes into your little narrative and gets repeated and repeated and repeated. And it's not really what happened at the scene of the crash. So one of the reasons why doing this right is so important is to prevent those compounding errors, which can affect not just a legal case, but the treatment and care that the victim gets. So one thing I just say that's super important is, if you ever witness a crash or come upon one soon after the crash occurs, the more that you can do as a citizen to help protect that victim, whether it's shooting pictures of the position where the car is in, where the bicycle is in, where the bicyclist is lying, where their bicycle is, where their light might have flown off into a field, anything that you can do like that, and get that information, not just to the police, but to the bicyclist by, if the person's semi-conscious, asking them what their phone number is, so that you can just, get your phone into their system, so you can get your information to them and their family later on. That is super helpful. Like, I have had a number of cases where good citizens have done that type of thing for the victims, and it's made all the difference. So, the police will often tell you they have it handled. but I've had situations where witnesses have gotten me, you know, a trillion times more information than the police about what actually happened. So that is one thing that's super important. You know, Gersh talked a little bit about balanced reporting, but it's true that most police officers arrive on the scene in vehicles and kind of are coming to the whole situation from a windshield perspective. And unfortunately, I think a lot of reporters too, when they report on these cases, they're looking at things like, what's the victim wearing? Were they wearing a helmet? They're not looking at, like, let's say we're in February, you never ever see in the newspaper a story about yeah, it being February, we looked at the windshield of the vehicle that drove into this, that had a driver that drove into this bicyclist, and, you know, the windshield wiper appears to have been worn, or the windshield wiper fluid was not changed, or the last date of service of the vehicle was this, or the headlights had, you know, salt and sand on them. You just never hear that type of thing. So the reporting is super one-sided and focused on victim behavior, when the cause of the crash, and we've had this happen in a number of cases, is actually something that the driver chose to do or not maintain with respect to their vehicle. Interestingly, when Gersh was showing you guys those photos about that parked car, it's important, you know, to understand how the crash happened. But it's also important in legal cases because that's a potential person responsible for the crash, the person who made that decision to put that car in that spot. And often what can happen, and what I'm seeing happen more and more, is that there's what we call an empty chair defense, that the defense attorneys are looking for something other than the person who's being sued to blame the crash on. And so they could say, well, you know, it may have been my guy's fault, but it also is really due to this illegally parked car, and try to get out of responsibility for the crash, even though the driver who hit the bicyclist made a bad decision by proceeding when they couldn't see around the parked car. They're then trying to shift blame to someone who's, you don't even know who they are if you don't have the license plate there, and trying to avoid all or a portion of responsibility. So it's critical for that reason too, for officers and anyone at the scene to document all of those types of situations. Another thing that we see that's really hurting bicyclists is that when there are stories about crashes, sometimes there's reporting about the consequences or lack thereof for people who make bad operational decisions. So let me see if I can share this screen. So last year, this story, can you see this story right here?
Not yet, Tori.
Can you see it?
Mm-mm. No.
Okay. So this story from the Lincoln County News talked about a truck striking a bicyclist instead of a truck operator. And the end of the story, you know, is the person, they talk about a fracture, and they talk about, the officer described, you know, this is a truck driving into a woman, and they describe her injuries as bumps and bruises. Then they say, no charges will be filed. So then you see, all right, here's the media not only reporting on this crash in a way that's, you know, not comprehensive, has some inaccuracies in it, but then they're telling the public that you can drive into a human being and that there will be no charges filed, which at the time was the case, and charges actually, you know, because this person ended up with an attorney, you know, charges ultimately were filed by the DA's office because there was discussion there. But the reality is this media still sends the message to the public that driving into human beings with a truck, with a 2-ton vehicle, is something that's just kind of normalized, and sorry, that just happens, and we're just going to all live with it. So that is another problem. And, you see good and bad examples of that. There was a woman who was struck and killed by a driver that was speeding and had claimed to have had sunlight in his eyes. And there, here in Maine, the reporter actually, when the charges were brought, and ultimately there was a deal struck, which was just, nothing in comparison to the loss of this woman's life. One nice thing that the media did do in the state was go to the Bicycle Coalition and get the Bicycle Coalition's perspective on the outcome of the charges against the driver. And that's an example of what should be done, because obviously there are two sides to this. And it is disappointing when people don't have consequences for their actions and should. We've talked a little bit about dehumanization.
Hey, Lauri, there's actually a question that came in from someone that maybe you could answer.
Oh, okay. Let me say.
It follows right in. How do we determine if charges were filed or push to get charges filed if injuries are not life-threatening?
That is fabulous. That's a great question. So I, in my earlier days of practicing law and in law school, I love the Freedom of Information Act. And in Maine, we have a state equivalent of Freedom of Access Act. And so you can actually, as a public citizen, ask for information about the crash. So if you're aware of one, and you can ask to find out what's happened with it, and file a freedom of access request. And you won't get everything always, but it's a tool that's available to us as citizens and as reporters. And again, this is another thing, is that in Maine, I have so many cases right now that are in suit that no one has bothered to look at or report on, and they involve victims. So you can also go to the court and see whether a case has actually been filed in a particular matter, and do a Freedom of Access Act request to the court. So
can I jump in on that as well to answer the reporting side of that? Just quickly, it's because, sorry, I have to decline this call if somebody keeps calling me, but when I showed you some of those narrative reports, often we'll have the victim's name and the victim's address, but most of the time we don't have the victim's name and the address. They decline to give it pending family notification that never comes. So that makes it hard. But what makes it even harder is we almost never get the driver's name and address unless that driver is in fact charged. So in the 90% of cases where a driver's never charged, you'd have to go through such an extra level of fact finding. And in New York, we have a very bad freedom of information law that prevents you from getting a lot of information. So just if a reporter isn't reporting on that in your community, it may be because the cops don't provide information, and then there's other stories to follow up on or whatever. You get overwhelmed, but it's hard.
Right. No, absolutely. There are difficulties there too. But a lot of times it's there. A lot of times there's an initial story, then, and I'm always like, why doesn't anyone care about what happened after that initial story? And what unfortunately happens is, I represent the victims or their families in the civil proceedings, and sometimes there are gag orders in, like, if the settlement is reached, and so we can't really comment after that particular time period. But that doesn't mean that other advocates can't ask about it. So if there are crashes that happened in the last, decade that you want to know about, that were in the paper initially, that did have the names and that you haven't heard anything on, those types of things would be subject to the Freedom of Access Act. And you could potentially get more information, including 911 calls and all sorts of interesting things. But I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure we save time. I've got plenty more to say, and I think I'm just going to make a couple of quick points and then turn it over to question and answers. One is, we really need to be treating what's going on as a public health crisis. So in my world, the fact that we've normalized crashes and said, this is just the price we pay for driving, that just translates to bad jurors. And you really have to work when you're picking out your juries for these types of cases, because people have already come into the courthouse feeling like, there but go I, for the grace of God, or however you say that expression, feeling like, these crashes are horrible things that happen to the people that hit the victims more than the victims themselves. And they don't see this as a public health crisis, like, gun violence, and they don't see all the victims as we're part of this Me Too movement of people that have been harmed. So we really have to do everything we can to treat what's going on as a public health crisis, because it's really taking more lives than some of the things that we do focus on in the media. And we also don't have integrated stories, like when we report on climate change, we don't talk about transportation. I mean, right now we're starting to, because we've got an administration that's looking at that, but historically that's not happened. Quick couple of things that you can do, and then we'll turn it over to question and answers. First, when you see bad reporting, I like to do, if I see bad reporting, I don't necessarily like to call it out in the comments section. I write a personal email to the reporter and editor and say, like, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Would you please do better in the future? You can do the same. When you see good journalism, share it, as widely as you can. Make sure that you explain to people why you're sharing it and how well written it is. Voting. So the people that are making decisions about how to crash report are sheriffs, DAs, others. We focus on state elections. We don't focus on local elections, but really focus on who you are voting for DAs and for sheriffs. Use the correct vocabulary yourself. Urge better police training on investigation and reporting. Take steps at the crash scene if you're involved in one or past one, and you can take steps to help and document. And support organizations like Streetsblog, BCM, and other organizations that are working and doing this work on your part. If you don't have the time to do it yourself, I always say, do what you can, act in your own way to support. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Lauri, so much. So to follow up on a previous question, when someone is involved in a crash and they are feeling like they are a victim, a lot of us, if we have an ailment, like, we'll hesitate before seeing a doctor. So what would you recommend people do as far as their hesitation with contacting a lawyer, whether it's the cost, or maybe it's really not necessary, or maybe I'm blowing this out of proportion? Do you have advice?
You asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so people that work in this field, you're not being billed. Most of us do not bill you by the hour for an initial, we don't bill you by the hour at all. And that's just a whole separate conversation. But for, I take calls regularly, just to, sometimes I take the case, sometimes I don't, but to provide basic information about rights and responsibilities and how best to handle things, because also, on top of all of these things we've discussed, what's really confusing can be all of the different insurances and how they come into play, and liens and things like that. So you really I think it's critical, there are a lot of great attorneys in the state, but some of them, it's like any other profession, you get a wide range. So what you want to do is get an initial consultation from someone who knows what they're talking about, and then decide whether you need to do it on your own or do it with someone that you trust.
Someone else asked whether the widespread use of cell phones and subsequently the amount of distracted driving that might be occurring, again, what is and what isn't reflected in reports. We know that there is an increase of distracted driving. Has that led to a number of crashes increasing in the last few years? And Gersh actually responded, yes, pedestrian deaths have increased 50% since 2009, which is when smartphones really became so popular. And we don't have slides ready to show you right now, but we see statistics showing the same thing. The data shows increases in pedestrian and bicycle victim crashes. And so vulnerable users, those crashes and fatalities have increased with the use of, or correlated with the use of smartphones.
Eric, can I just jump in? I know we're running out of time, but about that statistic, it's really important. The pedestrian death rate has gone up 50%, in about a decade. At the same time, the death rate, raw deaths and the death rate of drivers, people inside the vehicle, drivers and their passengers, has gone down. And that's a result of the fact that the cars themselves have become designed to be more safer to the person inside the car than outside the car. And that's something that federal administrations going back many decades, so it's neither a Republican nor a Democratic thing, just ignore. The design of cars, the crash ratings for cars for the people outside the car as opposed to inside the car is something that only now is being discussed at a federal level.
And similarly, only now do we start seeing people actually, I feel like in more recent years, the focus on infrastructure has suddenly begun to, people are aware that infrastructure leads to speeding, speeding leads to fatalities. So what can we do to change infrastructure to slow traffic down?
Nobody has an answer to that.
Money, lots of money. Unfortunately, no one wants to give it. Are there any other questions? We've hit our hour mark, but we can stick around and answer some more questions, respond to other comments. I'm going to share the last screen here that I have ready for all of you. Here's our contact information. If you would like to get in touch with one of us, feel free to reach out, give us a call, or email us. Like Lauri said, like she answers calls frequently just for people that need more information. Certainly you can contact myself, Eliza, or Matt at the Bicycle Coalition in Maine. If you go to our website, there's actually a contact box right there where you can submit a question or comment. So if you feel like you don't want to leap right into an attorney or talk to a journalist, you can always talk to us to start the process and we can pass it on when necessary. If you want to learn more about our anti-speeding campaign, thanks Eliza, she just shared it in the chat. You can go to our website and click on Slow Me Down. So this is our advocacy to actually change infrastructure, change speed limits, and slow traffic down through practice and behavior. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you Gersh, thank you Lauri, thank you Eliza for speaking and sharing your passions with us. And I'll be sending out an email with all the links that Gersh shared, those stories, the link for the report that Eliza was referring to, and some resources that Lauri also dove into. So look for that email. It'll be in your inbox within 48 hours, as well as the link to the recording for this webinar. Thank you for joining. Hope you can join us in 2 weeks for the next Wednesday webinar. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks.